Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be invited to be the presenter of a Gaines Lecture in Bioethics series. David has been a very good host, and I appreciate the warm reception and the good hospitality that I've found here. My presentation today is designed for discussion purposes, and following David Ducas's encouragement, it'll be a sustained reflection on some aspects of how the family of care ideas relates to the philosophy and ethics of medicine. I'd like to stimulate your interest and your research efforts in a limited range of topics related to care and its meaning. In doing this, I will draw on 15 years that I have devoted, initially part-time and now full-time, to the history of the idea of care in the Western world. What prompts my comments today is this intriguing question: what care ideas relate best to an analysis of the experience and ethics of medicine and healthcare? Now, in setting up my project, I realized that the word care has its own associated meanings, but that throughout the history of philosophy, theology, and ethics in medicine, other words in different periods of history have been used to convey approximately the same cluster of ideas, sentiments, virtues, and actions. And I've actually made a list of them. I thought you might be interested to hearing what they are. Mercy. It's interesting. All of these terms have been extremely powerful in history, and some of them, probably at least half of them, are in the process of being revived today by at least a few scholars. Mercy, philanthropy. Sometimes we use the term philanthropia to indicate its Greek origins, since today the word philanthropy has become something else. Associated with philanthropy has been the notion of humanity as virtue, covenant in the sense of covenant loyalty and covenant fidelity, hospitality, friendship, piety in the sense of paternal piety, devotion to the care of one's parents, filial piety, devotion to the care of one's children, and then state piety, devotion to the care of one's state. Justice, especially when justice has been defined in terms of compassion. Love and agape. Charity, and this one may surprise you, chivalry, the notions of care associated with chivalry. Benevolence and beneficence. Sympathy, compassion, and empathy. Stewardship, kindness, attention or attentiveness, and humanitarianism. It was recently said of John Hope Franklin, the great African-American historian, throughout his career, Franklin devoted careful, sympathetic attention to his many students and prepared conscientiously for meeting every class. Now, I'm giving this as an example of one of the points in your outline, which is that many of the care words that are used in philosophy and in medicine have shortcomings. Some of them sound a bit condescending, and so they are not so popular or currently used today. It's interesting that this historian, writing a review in the New York Review of Books of John Hope Franklin's autobiography, had to use 3 words. He devoted careful, sympathetic attention to his many students in preparation of classes. That's what I want to talk about today. Now, why would I begin a lecture in medical humanities with this offbeat comment that refers to an area of public and intellectual life seemingly far from medicine? John Hope Franklin. First of all, I believe that most of the virtues required in contemporary medicine are best learned from life in general and not simply from medical experience and the history and the philosophy of medicine. That's why I'm entirely comfortable citing a text dealing with the life of an educator to introduce a lecture on the philosophy of medicine. Second, and here we arrive at the topic I have chosen for today's discussion, I believe that the author of these comments, the reviewer William McNeill, who's Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Chicago, was not being redundant when he used 3 words to describe one thing, that John Hope Franklin devoted, quote, careful sympathetic attention to his students in the preparation of his class. The insufficient reach and connotation of individual care words leads many of us to combine them in order to suggest the range of notions and implications that we would like to see associated with a single idea. Now, I've thought about this, and I've written a little bit about this particular question, and I've sort of come up with the term that I use sometimes, which is sympathetic concern. And I'll explain in a moment. Sympathy seems to be a bit condescending, but when it's used adjectively with another word like concern, then I think it reverberates well. And I don't think we should be in the business in ethics or in medical dialogue, medical explanation or whatever, using terms that are too foreign to the sympathies, if you will, of the people who are hearing it. And so I've come up with this term, sympathetic concern. It's not my purpose to defend that today, but just to comment on that. And so this leads to my more explicit statement of my topic. The topic then today is the relationship of care as the generic term for all these ideas, the relationship of care to sympathy in the history of ideas, and then to point out the implications of the care-sympathy connection for medical ethics. First of all, the primacy of the idea of care. There's one story that has the power to shape much of our thinking, even much of our systematic thinking about a philosophy of care, a theology of care, an ethic of care. And that story is a relatively little-known Roman myth called simply care, or cura in the Latin. I keep going back to this extremely brief story because it only exists in one text, and the text is very brief. It's a story on the origins of care, and every time I do so, I find something new, which is why I have written on it a number of times. But quite frankly, I have ended up thinking with that narrative, to use that metaphor. Margaret Moorman, the physician, pediatrician, and religion and philosophy scholar at the University of Virginia, in her interesting new book, Attending Children, A Doctor's Education, it's interesting, the title of her book, Attending, which, as she points out, is both a virtue of attention and a description of what some physicians do in attending. She explains her approach to the clinical story she is telling in that she does not wish to simply narrate them, but to offer the results of thinking with her stories. Her approach was inspired by Arthur Frank, who in the book The Wounded Storyteller recommended that those who would write about illness, healing, and the ethics of medicine should think with the paradigmatic stories that deal with those topics. And Frank explains further, to think about a story is to reduce that story to content and then analyze that content. But thinking with stories ultimately makes it possible to have them shape perceptions of various experiences over time in which imagination and reason combine. I would add that beyond that, stories can accomplish much more. A story can be originary to use a technical term from philosophy, a story can be originary to, that is, in large part, account for an entire ethic. And I'm trying to suggest that this story accounts for the entire ethic of care and all of its permutations, including sympathy. Now, this primordial narrative, I'll tell you the story now. It's very brief. And to give it a category, it is a creation myth, an account of creation. As care, cura, obviously a female figure who is identified also as a goddess. As care once crossed a stream, she saw some clay. She picked up a piece thoughtfully and began to shape it. While she considered in herself what she had created, Jupiter came up to her. Now, Care asked Jupiter to provide soul to the clay form, and this he was pleased to do for her. But when she wished to give her name to this new creation, which was the first human, Jupiter would not allow it and said that his name ought to be given to it. And while Care and Jupiter argued over the name, Earth, that is Tellus, or the goddess Mother Earth, came up, and she wanted this creation to be named after her, since she had, after all, given it a part of her body. The three claimants asked Saturn to settle the matter. Saturn, who's also known as a god of justice. And Saturn gave them a just decision as follows. You, Jupiter, because you have provided the soul, should receive the soul or spirit when the creature dies. And you, Earth, because you provided the body, you should receive the body when this creature dies. But because Care first formed this creature, may she have it and hold it as long as she lives. And because the name of this first human was still up for grabs, still being disputed, Saturn settled that question as well, and he said, so it should be that this should be called Homo, the Latin word for human being, because it is made out of earth, the Latin word being humus. Now, because of the play on the Latin word, humus for earth, and hence the human being was called Homo, then we know it is at least partly Roman in origins, but it is partly also Greek in origins. Now, to properly interpret what this myth might mean for a philosophy of care today, we have to do a lot of thinking and reflecting. But first of all, we have to understand how this would have been understood in the 2nd century, which was when this was published, in a collection of myths edited by a Roman by the name of Hyginus. Now we come to the section, the vulnerable first human. In mythology, we learn that myths offer us an ancient narrative structure. Now, I'm just trying to clarify the term myth. Sometimes in popular speech, myth means a falsehood or just a meme, just a product of somebody's imagination. But that's not what the classical myths meant. They provide an ancient narrative structure which make the basic characteristics of human life meaningful, so that gods and goddesses and all the personages and events of a myth really represent, in large strokes, what it is that humans are all about, and human life and struggle is all about. In the course of history, and even in our scientific era, myths always have the power to shape our understanding of ourselves and our society. Now, here's the image we see of the first human prior to being declared the dwelling place of sympathetic care. The human, in its vulnerability, was destined by this story. The human being was destined to fall apart. Its body is described as very typical in classical, philosophical, Stoic terms, as well as in religious terms. Its body was being pulled down to the ground from which it came, while its spirit element strives upward to the divine from which it came. In this image, the first human lived in the constant threat of being split into its two constitutive elements through death. Furthermore, the human being needed an attentive, solicitous care that would hold it together. And one of the many things I derive from that is the fact that this primordial notion of care is not an image simply about how one ought to care for others. No, the image is of the individual vulnerable who is receiving care. And if that's the approach we take, it can lead to very, very different sorts of philosophical conclusions. So what we have here is a powerful image of the beginnings of the human community. After all, this first human is the first of a race in which human vulnerability is a dominant characteristic. that requires fundamental attention. And a human being born into a society of that kind can be confident that there will be a solicitous care which prevents the human from falling apart. Now, there is a phrase in this story that is certainly the most dramatic and I think important sentence in the story. Let care, I said when I gave it before, and I'll explain my translation, let care have it, it being the human being. Let care have it and hold it as long as it lives. Now, have it and hold it is my translation. The Latin word, and I do want to explain this because it's symbolic of the whole development of what care can mean. The Latin is possediat, that is cura possediat. Care will possess the human individual. But when you think about it, the Latin can be translated as possess, but it doesn't really mean possess in our sense today. We possess usually a thing. We never possess a person. If we do, it's an abuse of a relationship. And so I knew a different word had to be used. To have it, yes. But then there's this phrase, to have and to hold. It expresses endearment, which is what this is conveying. So I use that term, to have and to hold. There's a further reflection that can be given. If I had a blackboard, I don't really need it. The word possediat, you can imagine how it's spelled, P-O-S, and then, that's all right, David. No, it's all right. Then the second syllable in there is S-I-D, okay? P-O-S, S-I-D, and then E-A-T at the end is the ending. That middle syllable, S-I-D, from that the English word S-I-T comes, to sit. So possession for the Romans meant to take up one's abode in. That is, to sit in, to take up one's abode in, to dwell in. So this is very personal. Care is described as something that now, from the moment of creation on, will dwell within the human. Okay. Now, but what did then care mean? If we have this concept, it's personal, it also happens to be feminine, and it dwells within the human. But then for the Romans, again, what did this word care, cura, mean? The word for care, cura in Latin, manifested a certain ambiguity, particularly at this time in history, because it represents a polarity between two fundamental but conflicting meanings of care. On the one hand, the basic meaning of care in the Latin is worry or trouble or anxiety. As we would say today in English, she is burdened with cares, or his cares and worries are overwhelming him. So it has that meaning in English too. Now what I've found from my research I think is fairly kind of interesting, because I do research in a whole bunch of modern languages and in the three basic ancient languages of Greek and Latin and Hebrew. And what I've found is that the word for care in the English language, in all of the Teutonic languages, and in all the Romance languages, including Latin, the basic meaning is the same in all of them, and that is a worried care, anxious care, or care as anxiety. So it really can be argued philosophically, but on linguistic basis, that a worried care is the basic meaning of care. Now, around the time this story was published in the 2nd century, the dominant philosophical thought in Rome was Stoicism, and it was influencing the language. At that time, care came also to mean solicitude. So it's a solicitude that is a care that does not really abandon the worried notion. The worried notion, linguists will explain that there are bridge concepts. So this worried care bridges over to all the other meanings of care, because the word itself carries that connotation with it. And so solicitude, care solicitude, means to be devoted to, attentive to, and taking care of or caring about the self, for sure, but also it reaches outward. Solicitude for the other. Now, that's what we have in this story. The example is from Seneca, who saw care not so much as a burdensome force that drags humans down, anxiety, as the power in humans that lifts them up and places them on a level with God. This polarity is characteristic of the structure of care, as I explained, even as we know today. Now, the narrative shows that the first human is cared for with a worried care, but that worried care is transformed linguistically and culturally into solicitude, which is this ongoing, outward-reaching sort of care. We know from developmental psychology that the human infant learns and expresses sympathetic care or compassion for others in the very first year of its life. My point is that the primordial care of the myth is by its nature solicitous, and that solicitude is appropriately called sympathy. So this is the way I'm arguing here, is on historic grounds and textual grounds. Care is the basic virtue, but we see in solicitude, an element of sympathy. Solicitude requires sympathy, and sympathy can take up residence in, posidiad, sympathy can take up residence in our psyche, in our intentionality, and in our moral habits, just as the lady care took up residence in the first human she created. These then are my claims arising from a consideration of the myth called care. A society can be chiefly characterized by the view that vulnerable people can be cared for to the extent that solicitous care dwells within the members of that community. Furthermore, because of the vulnerability of those who would exercise care, we need to affirm and foster sentiments of sympathetic concern for those who are vulnerable and most in need, whether they be the sick, the desperately poor, those with mental weakness, the youngest who lack parents and caretakers, the poorly educated, asylum seekers, and other homeless people. Prior to any consideration of social entitlement or human rights or welfare rights, and prior to even any consideration of justice, sympathetic concern is for all ethics, is the basis for all ethics, that is both interpersonal and social, both public and professional. Furthermore, this narrative informs us that sympathetic concern for others and for self as human beings is the chief characteristic of the human community, and not care as a mere provision of care services for the members of a class or type. If we are not moved by the suffering of another in certain ways, if sympathy is not for us a primitive, natural response to the suffering of another, then we cannot even sustain the conception of what it is to be a human being, nor understand the human relationships in society on which any such life depends. While principles of justice remind us that all deserve equal treatment in care, the origins of care are found in the constantly repeated experience of facing other humans who manifest the shared vulnerability we found in the original myth, a vulnerability of not being able to be held together, body and soul. Even prior to viewing the specific suffering of another, the prospect of death evokes the response that we know as care. And so it's no wonder that later on, much later on, Martin Heidegger would develop a very elaborate philosophy of care, but is strongly linked with the concept of death. This experience of being with and for the vulnerable mortal other leads us to discover and disclose normativity instead of inventing it. Finally, this narrative makes manifest that the experience of sympathetic concern for the proximate other lies at the heart of what it means to have and preserve a society that cares, as well as professions that care. I would now like to explain how this primordial notion of sympathetic care plays a role in medicine and health care. This is part 3 now on the meaning of sympathy. We must acknowledge from the outset that the idea of sympathy for the sick connotes an element of condescension. That is why it is so important, first of all, to discover the inner meaning of the historical notion of sympathy. Furthermore, to avoid the negative connotation that is currently attached to this word, as I've said, I prefer to use the term sympathetic concern or sympathetic care. Now, sympathy has importance for medicine, and that importance depends on reversing the cure-care relationship to its relationship in antiquity, when the care-cure relationship was linear. Whereas today, we have separated the two, the purpose of medicine being seen as curing, and you kind of show some caring if you have time and energy for it. Both linguistically and culturally, in antiquity, the idea was always to care for others, and then you take care of others, and if you take care of others properly, you could anticipate that it might result in their cure. So we have to think about possibly reversing that if we're going to take care notions seriously in medicine. Francis Peabody, here I'm up to the point where it says the model for linking care with sympathy in clinical medicine is Francis Peabody's famous lecture. Francis Peabody, a Harvard University professor of medicine who was born in 1881 and died in 1927, published in the year he died in 1927 a much quoted article, now a real classic of medicine, called The Care of the Patient. Many people are familiar only with the closing sentence of that article, and this is the phrase of his closing sentence. And I've used this quote in some lectures before, say in grand rounds here or there, and I've noticed that physicians who at the time were, say, in their 60s and 70s and whatnot, and usually kind of sitting in the front row or whatever, when I would give this quote, they would mouth the words. It was clear that this was known by virtually all physicians of that generation. This is what Peabody said: the secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient. Highly interesting, using both meanings of care, the technical and the caring about. And furthermore, he links them. He doesn't just say they'd be nice together, but the secret of the correct and appropriate technical care of the person is essentially and necessarily based on caring about the patient. However, throughout this article, he is not advocating an ethic of care. He concludes with that quote about care. But his dominant notion there is sympathy. Now, in this lecture of mine, he fits in perfectly, because I'm trying to link care and sympathy as well. In so doing, he is reiterating the view of the 18th century physician John Gregory that sympathy is needed for a trust-based relationship between physician and patient. Peabody describes the vulnerable patient in these words: here is a worried, lonely, suffering man, and if you begin by approaching him with sympathy, tact, and consideration, you get his confidence and he becomes your patient. For Peabody, sympathy is requisite for the existence of the physician-patient relationship, not for its preferred mode of exercise. A physician cannot truly claim an individual as a patient unless the physician approaches the patient with sympathy. Note how sympathy goes far beyond a compassionate attitude toward the individual patient and assumes a fundamental role in defining the very structure and meaning of the physician-patient relationship. I want to make an appeal to foster the idea of sympathy in its connection with medicine, but with the full awareness that the connection may remain fragile for a long time. The connection between attunement to sympathy on the one hand and the pursuit of the techne of medicine on the other can be a fragile connection, one that constantly needs to be strengthened by institutional, social, and economic structures, as well as by philosophical inquiry, religious commitments, and finally, but perhaps most importantly, through discipline. As I read the history of medicine, I believe one cannot find an unbreakable link between the techne of medicine and personal caring in medical practice. There has always been the need to argue for this connection and to foster sentiments and commitments that would enhance and preserve this connection. Now, a definition of sympathy. Sympathy is derived from the Greek word sympatheia, It is constructed from the joining of sim, S-Y-M, and pathos. The meaning of that prefix sim is to be with or to have the same as another. The root pathos means suffering or experience or emotion. Accordingly, the literal definition of sympathy is the quality or state of being affected by the condition of another with a feeling similar or corresponding to that of another. We have a similar sort of definition with the word compassion. Compassion simply uses the Latin origins of the same two words, com and passio. But I want to point out here that the passio in Latin, and com of course means with, we've classically, I should say typically, understood compassion to mean to suffer with. And I would argue it doesn't mean that at all. Not the kind of suffering that's associated with pain or whatnot. Instead, the word passio is translated best as suffering something to happen to oneself in the archaic meaning of suffering. In contemporary language, we would simply say to experience with another, or to draw on the notion of passio, like the Greek pathos, as meaning emotion. Then you could say to be affected by the condition and the situation and the experience of the other person with whom we are relating. That's what it really means, both in the sympathy tradition and in the compassion tradition. So you see the two terms are really quite similar in meaning. Now, I could follow either one. As for me, in the rest of my lectures, in the rest of this lecture, I'm prepared to argue for the Greeks. I think the Greek tradition of sympathy is a much richer one and a much farther-reaching one. Now I'm up to the section Relevance of Sympathy for Contemporary Medical Ethics. Before I give a very brief survey of what sympathy has meant in science, medicine, and philosophy, some of the highlights, I want to jump over today and give you a situation or a type of case in which it is relevant. Patient selection for liver transplantation in the U.S. requires difficult ethical choices. Between 1993 and 1997, the number of U.S. patients waiting for livers more than tripled, from 2,997 to 9,637, while during the same period the number of cadaveric liver donors in the United States increased from 3,763 to just 4,579, so about 5,000 short of what was needed. Because there was no form of liver support comparable to renal dialysis available for patients, the shortfall between the number of potential recipients and the number of donors meant that clinicians had to literally choose who would live and who would die. Medical literature that appeared around 1991 showed that the amount of sympathy, and the word sympathy is used in these surveys, the amount of sympathy felt for patients and for groups of patients often determined the level of care given and could also significantly affect resource allocation, even to the point of outweighing the objective standards such as likelihood of success and cost effectiveness. For example, in an interview study of nurses, responses indicated that nurses and nursing students' sense of service to patients was influenced by their own feelings of sympathy. One nurse said, quote, "I have far more concern, sympathy, empathy in a case where I don't hold a person responsible for their predicament than when I do." When the nurse judges the patient to be responsible for his or her condition, the example given is alcoholic cirrhosis, the nurse judges the patient to be less deserving of care. When, on the other hand, the nurse judges the patient to be, quote, innocent of any guilt for his or her condition, the nurse decides that the patient deserves care. For the nurses in the study, moral judgments outweigh clinical judgments, clearly. Since nurses are the ones who most often decide who will receive medical attention, a consideration of how their feelings of sympathy affect their professional duties is a question of utmost importance for contemporary medical ethics. Physicians have also used sympathy as an overriding factor in making the decisions about patient selection. In an opinion poll in which gastroenterology specialists were asked to rate the suitability of hypothetical patients for liver transplant, these specialists rated the patient with the poorest prognosis as more suitable than the patients with alcoholic liver disease or a criminal record. Thus, moral judgment was regarded as more important than clinical judgment, and sympathy led to decisions opposite to those that would be reached in an objective decision-making process. A study of physicians' responses to patient misfortunes provides additional evidence for the influence of sympathy on resource allocation decisions. Among physicians who selected a sympathetic response to a hypothetical patient's misfortune, choice of the sympathetic option was associated with greater relative resource use in 3 respects. Sympathetic physicians ordered a greater number of laboratory tests per patient visit, spent a greater number of minutes performing CPR before declaring the effort unsuccessful, and had a higher preference for using intubation to aid a patient in breathing. Thus, in these physicians' decisions, patients who receive more sympathy from physicians receive a greater amount of resources, particularly in the case of liver transplant. At first, these issues in contemporary medicine led me to define this as the first question: what should be the role of sympathy in today's medical judgments? You know, there's the philosopher in me coming forth. What should be the role of sympathy in medical judgments? But now I think that's the wrong first question. The first question should be this: how can we not examine non-sympathy or antipathy in contemporary medical ethics? You have to examine that first if that's the problem, and then go from that to understanding and examining what sympathy means or should mean. How should sympathy and its lack relate to traditional concepts of medical duty? And then the overarching question: how should sympathy be linked with the techne of medicine? Now, let us turn to a brief survey of what sympathy has meant in history. It is customary in much of the scholarly literature of philosophy and medical ethics to say that any serious notion of sympathy really began in the 18th century with the Enlightenment thinkers. David Hume, Adam Smith, and their predecessors, Butler, Shaftesbury, and Hutcheson. However, I think it's convincing, to me at least, that the reason why the idea of sympathy should be received and given an important role in the philosophy of ethics and medicine today is because sympathy already had a very significant concept, had been a significant concept in both scientific and philosophical thought since antiquity, and had been used in medical explanation long before it entered the language of ethics or medical ethics. For example, the Stoics conceived of sympathy as a connective principle between a variety of separate particles that accounted for the existence of a functioning organic whole. While only a single part of an organism may be affected by a certain condition, the entire organism can be affected by means of sympathy among the parts of that organism. The best known ancient supporter of sympathy was the 3rd century philosopher Plotinus, who was influenced by Stoic philosophy. In his major work, the Aeneid, Plotinus proposed the theory that the universe is one animated organism. Each part of the universe affects the others and is affected by them, not by mechanical causation, but exclusively by mutual sympathy. He used this cosmological principle of sympathy to explain the possibility of magic, prayers, the effectiveness of prayers, astrology, and prophecies. He also proposed an anthropological function of sympathy. An appreciation of one's fellow humans is possible only on the basis of a sympathetic relatedness among human souls. And this response between soul and soul is due to the mere fact that all souls, all living things, indeed the entire visible world, springs from a single supreme soul, spelled with a capital S. Plotinus also regarded the notion of sympathy as being an ingredient in vision. He believed that the vision of the eye is forth-going rather than incoming act, and this was a fairly dominant explanation. Proper vision is dependent upon the perspective of the viewer rather than the object being viewed. Visual appreciation of an object is possible only if there is a sympathetic relatedness between viewer and object, and this relatedness depends upon the viewer's range of sight. With this example of sympathetic vision by the eye, Plotinus began already in the 4th century to elaborate sympathy as a physiological principle. Now, if I just add a comment about Plotinus, I think that some of Plotinus's view might be of interest to many intelligent people today. This notion of the sympathetic relatedness among souls as providing a foundation for biological, physiological, and emotional sympathy, I think would be very congenial to people today who have found ideas in Asian religions, in popular spiritual writings today, and in the history of Christian spirituality that was so strongly influenced in its early centuries precisely by the Neoplatonism of Plotinus himself and many others. I think there's a way in which certain notions of not only cosmological but social, human interrelatedness in terms of sympathy of souls can ring a bell for people today, but that requires a bit of developing. Corresponding to the cosmobiological understanding of sympathy, a physiological understanding of sympathy already existed in antiquity. The notion of sympathy appeared first in the Hippocratic writings, where it represented a functional collaboration of all parts of the human body. Soranus, a Greek physician of the 1st century A.D., named the method by which harm to one part of the body induces harm in another, sympathy. In his treatise Gynecology, he assigned 3 features to the concept of sympathy. First, sympathy can exist between specific organs, such as between the uterus and the stomach. Secondly, the sympathetic messages traveling from organ to organ were mostly messages of pain and disease, but also of therapy. And thirdly, his most interesting medical explanation that mind and body each have sympathetic effects on the other. For example, he taught that a nurse should not yell at a crying infant to make it quiet. And here is the quote of what he said: "For fright arising from such things becomes the cause of afflictions, sometimes of the body, sometimes of the soul." So a rather perceptive analysis of the physical emotional sympathy. Writing in the 2nd century and relying on Hippocrates, Galen defined sympathy in the context of humoral pathology, when the sickness of one organ was caused by sickness of another. And a famous statement from the school of Galen holds that, quote, "any part of the body may influence any other portion by virtue of common neural connections." So already in that time, the neural connections were being seen as key for sympathetic relatedness among the parts of the body. Now, in the early modern period, a well-known person in this history is Sir Kenelm Digby. He offered a theory of medical sympathy to explain not only the transmission of health and disease, but also the transmission of emotion. He uses the example of the pregnant mother and the infant in her womb. Sympathy in this case involves, quote, "a harmonious consonance between the bodies of mother and child." Digby's explanation was that sympathy is the vehicle for, quote, "a contagion of imagination in which the passions of one individual infect others." And then in 18th century physiological notion, sympathy referred to the natural harmony between the different parts of the body as a result of the action of the nervous system. And so Jacobus Benignus Winslow, Xavier Bichat, and Johann Christian were among those who explained the nature of the relation that they detected between the sympathetic nervous system and the central nervous system. Eventually, this key idea of sympathy was so influential in ancient and modern medicine, but it disappeared starting in the second half of the 19th century when the concepts associated with medicine based in the natural sciences began to appear. And now to the philosophy of sympathy. And here I'm just going to refer to the two 18th century philosophers. It's interesting, though, that already in the 17th century, the idea of sympathy was beginning to shift from physiology to the human sciences, and particularly in ethics and philosophy. A number of leading Enlightenment thinkers were arguing, and here the argument comes from, you might say, altruism, the notion of altruism. The argument that humans by their very nature put their own happiness first and ought to serve their own enlightened self-interest because enlightened self-interest. So enlightened self-interest was the dominant concept of the time. But these other thinkers claimed that in sharp contrast to that, they said that this tendency, enlightened self-interest, was motivated by the desire for economic and political change. Indeed, we find that being verified in today's America, I think. But the British moralists of the 18th century argued for the importance of sympathy and altruism in social philosophy and in ethics. Surprisingly, the most insightful examination of the phenomenology of sympathy was offered by the father of modern economics, Adam Smith. His theory of moral sentiments begins with these words: "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the future of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." He noted that sympathy is a fellow feeling that relates not only to the pain of others, but to any passion including the pleasure and happiness of others. For example, he argued that sympathy was crucial to our sense of propriety and hence to our social behavior, such as the reserve that we would show when talking of our own profession. And now we come to David Hume. I'm just going to single out again a few notions from David Hume, a key thinker about the philosophy of sympathy, and then from that I'm going to jump back to the 20th century, late 20th century question of liver transplant to see how some of those ideas can be used to solve this problem of a lack of sympathy among nurses and physicians. Now here's what David Hume argued. To become a good person, one doesn't consult a book of rules, but cultivates one's capacity for sympathy. So this is basic to the moral life. Not moral rules, but cultivating sympathy, as well as for the judgment needed when conflicts arise between different demands on our sympathy. Corrected sympathy is for Hume the fundamental moral capacity. So I just want to repeat that because that's going to become my norm for this, for the transplant issue. To become a good person, one doesn't just consult a book of rules, but cultivates one's capacity for sympathy and cultivates the judgment needed when conflicts arise between different demands on our sympathy. Corrected sympathy is for Hume the fundamental moral capacity. And I'm emphasizing this not to oversimplify it, but to say that the objection can be raised about sympathy, oh, you shouldn't really go there at all because it's so subjective and it's emotionally dependent and so on and so forth. We need just a non-emotional, rational rules. But his notion of discipline and of corrected sympathy, I think corrects that notion, but we'll come back to that. For Hume, sympathy for others is part of human nature. It is a propensity we all have to receive by communication the inclinations and sentiments of others, however different from or even contrary to our own. Furthermore, because of the social nature of sympathy, a perfect sympathetic relationship, sympathy exists in mutuality. and mutuality exists in society. So in order to develop proper sympathies for people and to be able to correct those sympathies, we have to understand the consensus of values and dispositions in a society that are going to affect our sympathies. Hume's writings on sympathy directly influenced John Gregory, the 18th century Scottish physician and philosopher, who is acknowledged as the founder of systematic medical ethics in the Anglo-American tradition, as well as history's most important proponent of a medical ethics based in sympathy. And quite frankly, we wouldn't be aware of that quite so clearly if it hadn't been for the work of Lawrence B. McCullough, who not only edited the works of John Gregory, but wrote a book on his medical ethics. Gregory held that the chief moral quality, quote, peculiarly required in the character of a physician is humanity. Namely, here he's defining humanity, that sensibility of heart which makes us feel for the distresses of our fellow creatures and which of consequence incites us in the most powerful manner to relieve them. And the moral quality paired with humanity is sympathy, which, quote, produces an anxious attention. So you see here, anxious attention is the basic meaning of care. So it produces an anxious attention to 1,000 little circumstances that may tend to relieve the patient. And, quote, naturally engages the affection and confidence of a patient, which in many cases is of the utmost consequence to his recovery. Now, it strikes me that John Gregory's medical ethics, published 240 years ago, would bring a new depth and a new art to the practice of medicine today, provided we could properly translate these notions of humanity and sympathy for today's situation. Now I want to return to the liver transplants. But because the liver transplants essentially involves the issue of non-sympathy, I want to highlight how we must approach this notion of non-sympathy through the use of another narrative. And here's how this came about in my inquiry. I was thinking a lot about sympathy and its history and what its relevance could be for today. And I'm always inclined towards narrative as a basis for a philosophy. And then I started thinking, well, the sentiment of sympathy, the idea of sympathy, the word sympathy, became most common in English usage in the 19th century. I thought, well, in the early 19th century, the most famous piece of literature, the most famous novel, perhaps the most famous, written at that time, might contain some reference to sympathy. So do you have any idea what piece of literature I turned to? Yes, yeah. I turned to Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, which of course has become, a great classic. And the general impression seems to be that Frankenstein, what is it about? The general impression seems to be that Frankenstein is a critique of science that has become amoral because it has transgressed a forbidden barrier, namely the creation of humans from human parts and so forth. By producing a monster whose violence is proof of the immoral nature of the scientific transgression. This, I think, is a fairly common perception of what Frankenstein's about. It's popular thinking among many people who have read it, and certainly it's promoted by the films that have been made of it. And then I picked up the book, and I went through it, and this was in the days before electronic, tracing. I just reread the whole thing and looking for the word sympathy. And I just found it on every page. It just colored all the thinking that was going on at the time. And then I came to this passage in the book, clearly the climax of the story, the only time that the monster, who remained unnamed, was able to speak for himself his own voice about his own condition and his own violence. And this is what he said. Finding myself unsympathized with, I wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin. We discover from the grotesque creature that his murderous violence is not due to his distorted nature, but to the lack of sympathy to which he is condemned by his Maker. This theme of the subjective experience of being isolated from human sympathy and of undergoing the agony and distortion of the self that comes from this isolation, a theme that dominates Mary Shelley's novel, necessitates a reassessment of the entire work. One could say perhaps more accurately that Frankenstein is not so much a critique of an amoral science as it is a cautionary tale warning that medical scientists and practitioners will produce moral and spiritual monsters to the extent that they divorce themselves from feelings of sympathy for the human products of their creative acts, as well as the intended beneficiaries of their curative and ameliorating actions. In a word, the dominant issue is not one of an ethic of control of science, but an ethic of sympathy that require us to avoid unsympathy and antipathy for the humans whose life or characteristics one has manipulated. And so finally, I just make a few concluding comments about the liver transplant case. And it is this. The medical literature shows that America's society's views on the fairness of liver allocation influence the allocation of organs. The public makes patient selection decisions on the basis of moral judgments. 1,000 members of the public were given 8 patients' case histories and were asked to select recipients for 4 donor livers. The public's view was that recipients who had misused illegal drugs or alcohol or who were prisoners were least deserving of a liver. So the public view on which doctors and nurses depend was really the same as the views of these doctors and nurses. And hence, Hume's notion of corrected sympathy, it seems to me, has to kick in as to whether or not there's going to be a consensus with society or a different direction that is taken. We don't want to neglect the role that sympathies will continue to play. You see, on the one hand, we could say we should abandon an ethic of sympathy and turn exclusively to objective principles of rights and fairness. The difficulty with that solution is that if you do that and implement it, and that's fine and it should be done, but to stop there will neglect the role that sympathies, in fact, will continue to play in selecting, slanting, and avoiding moral rules. And for that, one needs a professional ethic that is attentive to motivation and sentiment. In other words, an ethic not only of sympathy, but of corrected sympathies. And so that is what I'm suggesting here. We could develop a number of measures or rules or recommendation for education, but it seems to be that we need to absorb more and more the meaning of sympathy, its relatedness to medicine, and face the ways in which antipathy is influencing our decisions as well as sympathy, but also with the goal that medical education and medical ethics education should have the function of correcting or helping people to identify their antipathies and sympathies and to correct them in the style of David Hume. So those are my comments today on the origins of care and how it's carried out today with the notion of sympathy, and I'd welcome your comments or questions or discussion. Thanks very much. Yeah.
What is the effect, I'll take it from what I've seen in my clinical work and in students and residents. What I see is a resident who comes into the residency or a student who comes to clinical work with apparent sympathy, but with increasing patient load and increasing pressure and increasing demands, not only from the people that they're empathetic with, but also from people who are in control of their schedule. The sympathy seems to wane, and I've seen it become apparently gone, where the clinician becomes angry with the patient who originally, I've experienced it myself. How can we address that?
Yeah. That, I think, is a very good question for discussion. Let me try to repeat it. That you've seen in your own clinical experience that younger professionals, particularly medical students, I think you're referring to, were very high in their sympathies for patients, very highly motivated and very much attuned sympathetically to their patients. Whereas over time, because of various sorts of pressures, we'll just use that one word, that sympathy diminishes and, you believe, seems to disappear. And in fact, it not only ceases to exist, but some sort of anger comes into its place.
The antipathy.
Oh, the antipathy, yeah. I don't have a magical answer to that. I'd like to hear people discuss that here. I was involved in medical education for about 20, 25 years, so we face that all the time. I saw that happen constantly. I think it's a combination of two things. Number one is that it's the ideology of objective science and the demand for results. I think there is an ethos in modern medicine, particularly tertiary care medicine, that number one, the only thing that really counts is the objectively based, scientifically diagnosed medical condition, and then secondly, results. So that even in the patient who is irretrievably dying, the demand for more and more tests, when a consideration or sympathy for the situation of the patient would indicate to let up on that, it doesn't seem to set in. The reason is because there is a culture there, a cultural imperative to produce results, including some results that would tend to protect the medical practitioners, in their records. So I think what we're dealing with is not an individual thing. It's a collective thing. It's a cultural question in medicine. I'm encouraged by the fact of the creation of a division of medical humanism. It's very interesting, David, and I haven't had an occasion to mention, my view of that word, which is a bit unusual, medical humanism instead of medical humanities. But humanism, in the sense, I gave you all these parallel terms to care. One of them is humanity, which is associated with humanism, suggests an attitude, a culture, you might say. There is a culture of medical humanism, whereas humanities could be taken to be a set of disciplines that can be objectively studied and investigated. I don't know if that's the reason why you selected that title, but that suggests something very important, that if the humanism element can be injected not only early in the education, but at every stage and in the clinical setting, including the clinical training, I think that's what's needed. So those are my comments for framing the problem, and I welcome whatever people would want to say about that. It is a crucial question. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about your study of care, the developing and maintaining this sympathy. Is there anything as mundane as reference to time? Amount of human contact that is required to maintain that. It seems like every single meeting that I go to with residency faculty, people are ranting about we only have 12 to 15 minutes, but there's the sacred cow that we can only take 12 to 15 minutes. Do we need to be looking at that as part of eroding the sympathy if we really don't have, a factor called time?
Yeah. No, I have a thought about that, and I think it works two ways. Just to be very simple about it, more time needs to be devoted to patients so that there's a sense of caring for patients. But I'd also argue to devote less time to it, but do it well. And let me give an example again from history, because I think it's very illustrative of the problem. Around the time that Francis Peabody wrote this essay in 1927, Cabot, his colleague there, was very concerned about the lack of the caring element in hospital medicine in the 1920s. He saw it as a great crisis. Even nurses, who were known for their humanism and compassion, just didn't have time anymore because of scientific medicine already in the 1920s. So what did he do? He took certain steps, and it resulted in the creation of two new professions. One, he thought, well, the people who would be very good at compassion would be people in religious ministry. So he arranged from local seminaries in Cambridge to have something whereby seminarians and ordained clergy could actually come into the hospital and become part of the system as associates. And that produced a new educational system, clinical pastoral education, and it produced a new profession, which is ministers in medicine, or whatever you want to call it. And they would add a caring element. The other profession is clinical medical social work. He thought if you got social workers involved in medicine, they would be able to add this human element. So this notion of medical social work also originated at the time. The result was the caring element would be taken care of by non-medical professions. I call them clinical professions, but they were not physicians, okay? And neither were they nurses. But they would sort of take care of it. In a way, that's kind of passing the buck. It might include more caring element in the overall institution. But I think that all physicians, let us say even surgeons who typically don't see very much of the patient prior to the surgery, but all have an obligation of sympathetic concern for the patient, even if it's shown in a very brief sort of a way. You know, there are certain kinds of words and attitudes that can be conveyed that they care about what your situation is. Are you worried about it? Only takes a few seconds to say, are you worried about this? And can I answer any question that will help you to understand what's going on for you? It may not take 20 minutes. It may take 3 or 4 minutes. So the amount of sympathy shown to the patient cannot be measured in numbers of minutes or times. It depends on the profession and the structure of their schedule as that's laid out for them institutionally, but it can be done quite effectively depending on the professional contact, even with relatively small amount of time. Yes?
First of all, I want to express appreciation for this marvelous, informative survey of classical studies and history, and particularly, in my judgment, the resuscitation of David Hume, whom I think has been sadly neglected and vilified. But I want to express appreciation for that. Secondly, I'm intrigued by your notion from Hume about this balancing of sympathy. I think we have found that sympathy alone, in terms of the emotion of sympathy, or in this case of the patient, is hardly sufficient to make some of the tough choices that are being faced. Is the UNOS plan of benefiting the patient, or giving the patient the transplant who will seemingly benefit the most, the kind of resolution that you have in mind about the crisis with regard to transplants?
I guess I should try to repeat this. I'm sorry if I didn't repeat the other one. After saying he appreciated the historical survey and so forth of the concept, and especially he was appreciative of the idea of David Hume being singled out, asked the question about, let me see, I don't know if I can summarize that, whether the patient most likely to benefit should be...
Resolution of the sympathetic problem, shall we say.
Yeah.
Might that be in the medical judgment that this patient who will seemingly benefit the most, rather than the one who is simply next on the list, might be the kind of resolution that you had in mind?
Whether the patient judged to potentially benefit the most might be the best way of going for the sympathetic route. Well, I'd like to have a discussion on that. Yes, I think certainly all medical judgments are based on the idea of benefit and hoped for benefit and prospective benefit. I don't think I highlighted from this literature that I was surveying that it was felt that alcoholic cirrhosis is not a contraindication or shouldn't be regarded as a contraindication to transplant. And that's why I gave the conclusion, but not the data. That's why this literature concluded that the moral judgment really took the place of or bumped out the appropriate clinical or medical judgment in the case. So I don't know. I'd like to see what you all think. I think that one should have sympathy, therefore, professionally for those who could benefit most from it. But at the same time, not be pulled into a situation where we judge this benefit on the basis of misapplied antipathies. Does anybody have a contribution to that, or where does that leave it for you?
Well, that's a good question. In my judgment, it seems to me that the medical indicators are a wonderful way to balance out the soft point in decision making, which is often muddle-headed, which we call sympathy. Sympathy can sometimes parade as extravagant emotion.
Right.
It makes no tough judgments.
Right.
It doesn't matter what it is. We simply sympathize. We empathize. Doesn't
Right.
feel.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that medical judgment, the one who may benefit the most, at least on medical indicators, seems to be the one who will, is something of the point that Hume was trying to make, this modified sympathy, this educated sympathy.
Well, on the one hand, I think there's something to what you're saying, that to rank the decisions in such a way that medical benefit would trump the dilemma is one way of providing corrective sympathy, to correct one's sympathy. On the other hand, this is a situation where sympathy and justice have to show an interplay. If we have a sympathy, as Hume said, for the social reality, for the community, for the mutuality of people, then that might incline you to be sympathetic towards the next person on the list who's been waiting a long time, who is suffering, who might not benefit as much, but is in that sense, the sense of fairness, is deserving of an opportunity to get a medical intervention that might prolong her or his life for a considerable period of time, even if it's not as curative as it would be for another person. So I don't see that as really, solving the problem directly. I think it leads to a reconsideration of the notion of fairness and how that relates to corrective sympathy. Yeah.
Do you discriminate between the words sympathy and empathy?
Whether I distinguish between sympathy and empathy, what follows. I've talked about sympathy and compassion in the lecture. Empathy is another word. That's true, I didn't mention it. Empathy is a more recent word. It has a much more recent origin. It happens to be the caring word du jour of today. In the medical literature, we see things on empathy more than we do on other things. There are books out on empathy, good analysis. Jody Halpern's book is very, very good. She's a psychiatrist, philosopher, does a wonderful job in analyzing empathy. I think that what's happening here is that empathy is just the term that's being used. It's people load into empathy things that don't belong there. Yeah. Empathy in its origins comes from this German Einfühlung, which is allowing one's feelings to be filled by the emotion of others. by feeling out into the other. And so it has to do only with that phenomenon. But compassion and sympathy suggest an attitude towards other people about what we appropriately should be doing to help and relieve other people, which empathy doesn't really contain in its origins, unless you kind of manipulate the idea and try to redefine it. So, and then what the literature is doing now, and it's good literature, I mean, these are philosophers, they're working hard and they're making contributions, but they're kind of rediscovering a problem that already existed. How do you put limits on the sorts of emotional baggage that you can take on yourself in the effort to alleviate others? This is something that's been debated under the rubric of compassion and of sympathy for a number of centuries. And so I'm not so sure that there's sufficient attention to history, but also because I just think that empathy is too narrow a term in and of itself to convey the whole rich notion of what sympathy is about.
Now, the other point I wanted to make was about antipathy, that people come in with their biases, and that somehow they will shade their ability to be sympathetic, to have sympathy towards patients.
Yeah.
But there's another lurking problem, and it's that of apathy.
Yep.
And people don't have to necessarily be have antipathy towards a person or bias towards whether they're alcoholic or a smoker who now has lung cancer. But some of them just don't care. And it's just a lack of a desire to go ahead and extend oneself personally in terms of being caring. And that apathy, which is a part of, unfortunately, through a lot of the education that occurs, particularly in residency work, you just get the work done, don't worry about the emotional facets of it, is something that is a concern to me. And particularly because a lot of times you'll hear residents and medical students too say, that's not our concern. You brought this up nicely, so it's a nice segue. The chaplains will take care of it. Or the social workers will take care of it. We don't have to take care of it. And so there's this it's not my job type philosophy of practice, which is concerning. So it's not just antipathy, it's apathy that I'm concerned about in terms of trying to introduce sympathy more into clinical practice.
Well, I find apathy an enormously difficult question, because with antipathy, at least, or non-sympathy, that is to be positively non-sympathetic, at least you have somebody who is being affected by the other, and it results in an opinion and an attitude towards the other. We believe that it's a wrong attitude, it's misplaced, it's leading to neglect or whatever, but at least they're engaged and they care, The problem of apathy is a very, very deep problem. Rollo May has written well on this back in the 1950s or 60s, and he analyzed it in terms of the apathy surrounding the Vietnam War and the people who came back from that. And then he concluded that the solution to apathy is the fostering of care, that care is the opposite of apathy. So it's an enormous problem, and I'll give one other example of that. It's a sort of an apathy. It's if by apathy you mean just not caring, I just don't care about any of that stuff at all, positive or negative. There's a new book out, and it's astounding for a philosopher, a classical, contemporary, analytic philosopher who grinds out all of these conceptual distinctions, right? And he's sort of at the top of American philosophers, top-ranking American philosopher. He's produced a lot of these scholarly analytic stuff. He's written a book which is about this big. It has about 10 words on a page, and there's a total of, maybe 2,000 words in this tiny little book, and it's the #1 New York Times bestseller. And the author is Harry Frankfurt, and the title of the book is On Bullshit. It's a careful philosophical analysis of bullshit as a way of speaking. Somebody, is talking bullshit, and he analyzes it very carefully. And he has something rather profound to say about it. What's important to know about bullshit, he said, is how dangerous it is. Because the bullshitter just doesn't care. He doesn't care what he says or the effect it has. He just feels like bullshitting. And that's so much more dangerous than the liar. The liar knows what truth and falsehood are. He just chooses to go in the direction of falsely representing, you know. So the liar cares about truth and falsehood. The bullshitter doesn't care at all. And so it's kind of a part of our society that certain kinds of behaviors and attitudes are growing that are quite apathetic and deserve some analysis. He ends up arguing in favor of caring about, you know, and how we might go in that direction. But it's dangerous, especially if it's in the clinical setting. Yeah. Barry?
I understand, or at least this is what I gathered from what you said, that you understand care or sympathy for being interpersonal or intersubjective, or its real efficacy, its real value lies in the fact that it's an intersubjective phenomenon. And I'm wondering if you would just explain a little more to what extent you see its value to lie in the fact that the physician cares for the patient, and to what extent do you find its value to lie in the fact that the patient perceives the physician as caring or being sympathetic. I understand it's both, but how important is the patient's own perception of the doctor as being sympathetic?
So the question had to do with sympathy being interpersonal, you might say the subjective element of one person relating to that of the one being cared for, and how the notion of whether the patient perceives the caregiver as caring about their situation, makes a difference at all. I'll just give you one, very, very small example, and it's a very imperfect example, but it's one that impressed me a lot. When I first went to the medical center at Georgetown University, I thought it would be good to go on rounds, and I was warmly welcomed in the oncology division. And so I went on rounds with an oncologist who I thought was a very personable guy and a fine interpersonal sort of person, and he certainly welcomed me, and I learned from him. And maybe just in the very first week that I was doing that, we walked into a patient's room, and with some students and residents, and this team just walked over to the patient, and the physician examined her throat externally, whatever, and made a comment and asked about something on the chart, and made another comment, and walked out with the team. And I stayed there for a while, and I saw this enormous suffering coming across this woman's face. And I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "He looked at my throat, he never looked at me." So what's important here about the perception of being cared for is this, that if you don't show it, you do harm. I think the physician and other health practitioners, nurses, they're faced with a dilemma without knowing it. When they walk into the room, they have their choice of either damaging and harming on the one hand, or benefiting in a more comprehensive way on the other hand. When they walked out, they had harmed by abandonment. And she was right. Well, of course she's right. She couldn't be wrong. She told me how she felt, and it was not unreasonable. So she surely, it can't be questioned, she was right. But there's something objectively wrong about a system that enables that to happen, that she was never addressed as a person, but only as a throat. So that's why it's important. At least, like I said, we learn most about sympathy by looking at the non-sympathy or antipathy. The idea of being cared for is best understood when the being cared for is trampled on. and the person feels abandoned instead of cared for. That reveals the power of care more than anything else.
We have one last 5 minutes.
Well, my question sort of is similar to Ozzy's. I was thinking about the distinction between caring and sympathy, and whether or not sympathy can be a relational experience, but a one-directional. So I can sympathize for another, but I often think of caring as being two people involved in a mutual relationship. And I'm not sure if that's what you're saying. They have been overlooked as patients. There was no sense in which there was a give and take in that relationship. Even if the doctor has been sympathizing, like he has sort of damaged her in some way. So I'm trying to teach apart these ideas of sympathy or care. Even going back to your myth, right? The gods are up there thinking about the newly created human, but the human isn't a character in any strong way, at least in what I've heard. But they're not asking what does a human want? What do you want to be named, or who do you want to be when you grow up? They're divvying up their rights over them. That doesn't seem to be a relationship in a strong, caring way, in one sense. Maybe sympathetic about the other.
So the question has to do with the relationship between care and sympathy in this sense. The feeling of not being cared for, is there a parallel in the notion of not being sympathized with? That is to say, do both terms express a kind of a mutuality? I mean, that's sort of how I read it. Well, it depends on how you see these things. David Hume saw them as mutuality, that we care, that we are sympathetic towards the other, and that sympathy has to be returned before it is really effective as a tool. The notion of sympathizing with has to be shared and sent back in the other direction. And it's only when there's a mutuality of sympathy that something can happen. In the medical sphere, I would say, where healing can happen. Now, this is something that it's hard for Americans to understand, I think, because of our conditioning of how we think philosophically. Quite frankly, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but your analysis of the myth of care is a manifestation of the need for the unilateral. That is to say, giving a voice to the one being cared for. It's like taking a newborn. What name do you want? And because we're so attuned to autonomy of the individual, whereas in the ancient worldview, everything is very cosmological and social and political. The polis, there's things that unite all of us, and we have to be concerned about all these larger relationships. So the framework, is very different. But to come back to your specific question, yes, sympathy requires a mutuality. Now, linguistically, it means something to us if we say, I felt like I was cared for or cared about when the physician entered the room or whatever. We're not so likely to say, I felt sympathized with, because then sympathized with evokes some larger relationships or whatever. But I don't worry so much about the language. The idea is the reality. So if I identified the core of what you're asking, I think it resides in this notion of mutuality. And quite frankly, I think our cultural situation is one where that is a challenge for us. Are we really willing to admit that mutuality is what makes relationships and society and professions and everything else work? Assumptions about mutuality, community, cooperation, and so forth. If everything is still autonomy of the individuals, no matter how beneficent they may try to be or how benevolent they may try to develop in their attitudes, it's ultimately not going to work if we don't have also a philosophy of mutuality that's going to inspire him.
I have 2 quick announcements. First, Matt Whittier will be our standby lecturer next week on Thursday the 23rd. That will be taking place in the ground floor auditorium.